Gun violence in America, an important health topic, an important choice topic. Hi, everybody. I'm Dr. David. Welcome to another episode of Your Health, Your Choice. I'm joined today by Shari Kulanu, who is both our executive producer of this show, as well as my sister. Hi, Shari.
Hi, David. So glad to be here.
Yeah, and it's another tough conversation for us to be having here, but I
Yeah.
think an important one. Now, our goal here is to be open-minded, to be solution-oriented, and to be practical. Now, this is not an easy topic. In fact, it was the most difficult one that we've had to do so far, just in terms of show prep, making sure that we got it right, that we were looking at the different angles, probably because we know that everybody has an opinion about this, but we realize that opinions are able to be changed, and of course, part of that is actually bringing different points of view and thoughts to people that they may not have thought about before. Now, we're going to be doing this in 3 episodes because of how challenging and long this topic is. So, we're going to be laying the groundwork about why we're talking this in the first place and some of the important statistics. Our second episode is going to be really looking, is this a gun problem? Is this a people problem, or both? And our third episode is going to look at areas of possible solutions. Now, before we get started, I would like to invite everybody to please join us on our various social media platforms. Please subscribe. Please hit the notification button so you know that when we're putting out another episode. Now, Shari, if you could please maybe go a little bit further as to why we're covering this topic.
Sure. So this topic is obviously related to health and medical issues because when we're talking about injury, fatalities, mental health, and all of the things that sort of are invoked when we're talking about gun violence, those things obviously have to do with health. We're also looking at things such as suicide, and in future topics, you'll be talking about safety and ways to keep kids safe. But this is also a choice issue. And so I'm going to toss it back to you. We did this because of Gun Violence Awareness Day in part, but there's other reasons why we're looking at this as a choice issue.
Yeah, we all have choices in terms of how we are going to proceed, what we're going to advocate for, what we're willing to accept in terms of limitations relative to guns, what we're willing to accept in terms of respecting the Second Amendment and people's rights to be able to own guns in the first place. Now, also, we are recording this on June 3rd, which is National Gun Violence Awareness Day. We had actually planned on doing this topic before all of these most recent mass murders, but nonetheless, here we are today. Now, as of this recording, in 2022 alone, there have been 233 mass shootings in the United States alone. Now, I also want to keep in mind that this is not just about preventing mass murders. In fact, that mass murders only comprise of less than 1% of all of the gun murders, gun deaths in our country, and so that's obviously very small. Although certainly because of how traumatic they are and how we hear it on the news and just fear for our overall safety, it's a very important 1%. But there's so much more to this topic than just this. Now, Shari, we're in a civilized society. Talk a little bit more about just some of our moral goals and etc.
Yeah, well, this comes into what the choice aspect of this, right? We all have choices to make, both as individuals, as families, as a society in general, local communities, state and federal levels. Like there are choices to be made, and one of the things that I think we need to look at is the role that guns play in our society, and what is the goal of the weapons that we develop and the weapons that we carry. Are we developing these guns in order to kill people? Are we developing them to incapacitate people? All of this matters in terms of the type of weapons that are used, the type of weapons that are available. And these are just some of the choices that we have to make. And so we're not going to tell people what choice to make. That's not what we do on this show. What we do on this show is kind of look at different perspectives and try to help people come to whatever conclusions make sense to them. But our overall goal is to help a choice be made so that we can make some kind of change in how this tragedy is playing out.
Yeah. Now, as our legal expert, as our law school graduate, talk a little bit about our Second Amendment here.
Sure. So, the Second Amendment is actually only one line long. And different parts of it get pulled apart and used in different ways in our culture. But the text says this: a well regulated militia, being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Now, you know, we're not going to sit here and debate that people don't have a right to have guns, because it pretty much says so right in the Second Amendment. Right, that part is, it is clear, and some people may argue otherwise, but it does say that that is a right. But it also says a well-regulated militia, and that's actually a part that has not necessarily been at the front and center of the Second Amendment conversation. And it's an important part. It's how the whole amendment starts: a well-regulated militia. And so, one of the things that we've talked about is regulations in our culture. We've talked about it as it relates to vaccines. We've talked about it as it relates to reproductive choice. Well, we're also talking about it as it relates to firearms. Now, there are regulations in our society that are kind of universally accepted. We just take them as, yeah, of course those things are regulated. For example, purchasing of alcohol. You can't purchase alcohol if you're 7 years old, right? There are state levels. There was eventually a federal rule around that. You also can't operate a motor vehicle at any age, right? If a vehicle can go a certain speed, if it can cause a certain amount of damage, then there are regulations around that. There's regulations around voting as well. Um, David, I want to ask you this question, because this is something you've talked about in terms of regulations. So, the Second Amendment was written a couple hundred years ago. What does that have to do with where we are today?
Yeah, and so much of this, we obviously have things in our society, technology, etc., that our founding fathers could not have possibly imagined. Okay, so when they were writing this up, they obviously weren't taking into account military style weaponry, etc. So how could they have possibly been able to give more information about that? But the First Amendment, which clearly talks about the freedom of speech, but yet it is, but we can't just go into a movie theater, that as the kind of the example that's often thrown out there, and yell fire, right? That's a public hazard. You can't just do that. Okay. Now, you know what? At the time that the First Amendment was written, there weren't movie theaters, right? So that particular thing wouldn't have possibly been able to be contemplated back then. So times change, technologies change, understandings of things change, and part of a civil society has to include taking those new things into account as we put our laws together. Now, yeah, so please
Okay.
continue.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So, I'll say that we wanted to look at some of the statistics that are related to this, because it's kind of what's driving this conversation. Um, we're going to look at some different angles. Specifically, we're going to look at two aspects of this. We're going to look at the toll that this has taken on individuals, on communities, on our country. And then we're also going to look at some statistics related to the prevalence of firearms in our culture and some of the ways that affects safety in our culture. So let's start by talking about the human toll that gun violence takes on us.
Yeah. And so I'm going to be quoting 2020 statistics. All of the stats references are going to be listed down below in the notes. So please look there if you want to get more information as to where we got this from, or more information in general, because most of these have additional statistics as well. But we don't want to overwhelm you with statistics either. Okay. So in 44,500 people plus die last year, or 2020, on for gun-related injuries in the United States in one way or shape or form. That can be compared to over 38,000 from automobile accidents, but also 75,000 for drug-related overdose deaths. 79% of all murders, whether it's homicide or suicide, involve a firearm in our country. But also, more than half of the gun-related deaths in our countries are suicides. So this is such a bigger problem when it comes to gun violence. And I know we keep talking about these mass shootings, but from that mental health perspective, half of the deaths are happening from suicides. And so one of the things we're going to be talking about is how can we prevent or reduce that as well. But the impact is well beyond just people being killed. The injuries, sometimes completely life incapacitating types of injuries that are going that. The ability for a person to work after an injury and to be able to take care of themselves or their family. The psychological aspect, whether you are a family member who lost somebody, whether you were whether you were a witness to something like this. Imagine these kids who have witnessed firsthand a gun shooting like we happened in Texas. That is something that they are going to be scarred with for the rest of their life because of nothing that they did whatsoever, yet they're going to be impacted on this. Just this year alone, there have been 27 school shootings. Okay. Our kids are at risk. Parents, the mental aspect of am I going to see my kid by at the end of the day after I drop my kid off at school? How safe do I feel about my child being in school in the first place? Imagine how that must feel as a parent. Just terrible things. These are things that we should not have to worry about, but yet here we are. Now, also, part of this with the statistics do have a connection with both the accessibility and prevalence of guns in our society. So, Shari, can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. And so just to distinguish, the accessibility is how easy is it to get one? And then the prevalence is sort of how common they are, how many there are. So, we were looking at statistics and we were trying to decide which statistics actually made sense. If you compare the United States to every single other country on the planet, you come up with, one statistic. But what we decided is it was most relevant to look at if we compare the United States to other similar countries. In other words, other generally high income countries, those that have a population of more than 10 million or more. So here we go in terms of looking at the prevalence of firearms. In the United States, there is an estimated more than 400 million guns. Now, that includes police, military, and civilian. Okay, so that's more than one gun per person, including infants and children. What's interesting, though, is that more than 98% of the stock of firearms is actually in civilian hands, right? Um, Another interesting statistic about the prevalence here is the United States makes up 4.25% of the world's population. Okay, 4.25%. However, we have a third, 33% approximately, of all civilian guns in the world in our country. So that's a really important thing to look at. Now, I want to talk about a couple other things here. I want to look at firearm homicides. So the United States, when you compare us to other similar countries, ranks homicides as 13 times greater than in France, all right, and 22 times greater than in the European Union as a whole. So, with all other things being equal, when we look at mental health, when we look at all of the other topics we're going to be talking about in some of our other episodes, somehow the United States is an outlier, right? And as a result, we have a responsibility for figuring out what is causing this, right? And that, again, as we'll get into in some of the other episodes. David, I want to ask you about this statistic. 7% of all childhood deaths are caused by firearms. So as a pediatrician, how does that land with you?
There's things in our world that we won't have control over. We know that childhood cancer is certainly a top killer. Okay, automobile accidents, again, mostly negligence relative to that. But should a child ever be killed by a gun? No. Now, of course, there's going to be accidents. We know that that happens. There's always cases about how guns are stored, left around, etc. Which, of course, that's a tragedy. And that's a very solvable problem right there. But we're talking about beyond that. We're talking about whether it's collateral damage, whether it's somebody who does walk into a school because they say, "Hey, I'm going to go shoot up a class now." Okay, so I mean, how terrible is that? I mean, how every not just every pediatrician, every parent, every human being should shudder at the fact that there are children out there being killed by guns. You know,
Yeah, yeah. And this is partly why this was a hard topic, right? It's not just a hard topic because it's overwhelming, the amount of different angles you can look at this, the amount of different factors that involved, how insurmountable some of this seems. But it's also a hard topic because it's painful. It's heartbreaking. One of the statistics that we had found was that most suicide by youth, if they're using a firearm, um, overwhelmingly they're using the firearm of somebody in their family or in their home, right? So, this is certainly something that is very much impacting the kids in our society. I wanted to look a little bit, we studied this in legal field, of course, is some of the reasons why guns are so accessible in this country and so prevalent compared to other places. And part of that is certainly because we have it embedded in our Constitution as Second Amendment to the Constitution that there is some type of a right that civilians have, to be armed, to bear arms. Then there's a culture that has kind of come around about that. But we also have issues related to, we are a capitalist society. We sort of give a lot of unfettered access to industries being able to advertise and proliferate their products, whether we're talking about hamburgers, automobiles, or guns. That's just something that in general in the United States we think is part of free speech, right? But there's a commercialism aspect of it in which, we kind of have allowed guns to become more prevalent in our culture because we treat them like we do lots of other commercial products. We don't sort of separate them out as being one of the things that causes so many fatalities and injuries. But we've also, one of the reasons why it's so prevalent in our culture is we've had a complete breakdown and failure in some very basic things related to removing weapons from very, known violent offenders and that type of things. Certain stopgaps and screenings that we've tried to put into place that have been taken away. So that's another reason why. So David, talk a little bit about, and then we're going to wrap up this episode and we're going to sort of like ponder this again, and then we're going to come back and talk more. What are some of the statistics related to the prevalence of firearms as they relate to homicide and suicide?
Yeah, and before I actually go into that, one other thing I think is really important. We fully recognize that the overwhelming majority of people who own guns are not committing crimes. They are not out there trying to hunt people down. Okay. And we know that the overwhelming majority are very responsible people, people who have properly trained, who have properly stored, who have properly educated their children. And, I get that. I appreciate that. I appreciate how so many people do take that into account when, in terms of their purchases and storage and everything like that. So again, this is not something that we are putting at the hands of because you are a gun owner, you are part of the problem. That's not where we're coming from. But nonetheless, statistics are just that. They're statistics. Now, one of the things that we learned as part of our research, and again, all of this information is referenced down below, is that states with weaker gun laws have higher rates of firearm-related homicides and suicides. And in addition to that, higher rates of mass shootings are in states with higher rates of gun ownership. Coincidence, correlation, causation, lots of conversation can be had as to what this means, but those are the facts.
Yeah.
Okay, so we're going to wrap up here for our first episode. Again, please check out our other two episodes that we're going to be putting forth shortly. And again, once again, please join us on our social media. Subscribe to us. Please join us along, and we hope to share more with you soon. Have a nice day.